The night before my first great parade, the oldest man in the regiment took me down to the guard room and made me learn the names of the dead. He did not ask if I wanted to. He simply found me where I was sitting on my cot, working a cloth across a buckle that was already as bright as it would ever get, and he said, "Bring your gloves and a clear head, not your rifle." I had served 4 months under Sergeant Holly's vein, and in 4 months I had never once heard him explain himself. So I put down the cloth and followed him into the dark of the lower corridor, where the gas lamps burned low and our boots made the only sound, and I did not ask where we were going, because you did not ask vain things. I should tell you what I thought I knew that night. I thought I knew the parade. I had drilled it until the slow march lived in my hips, until I could carry the 8-pound rifle for an hour without a tremor, until the order of the columns was a thing I dreamed. I was 19, and I was certain that the next morning's spectacle, the band, the crowds along the route, the great gilded gates of Marchmont thrown open, the standards lifted into the cold spring sun, was the whole of it. I thought the regiment was the marching. I was about to learn how little I understood. Vane stopped before a low oak door I had passed 100 times and never opened. He took a key from a ring he carried that I had never seen him use, and the lock turned with the heavy, oiled click of something kept in good order. "The Hall of the Colors," he said. "You'll have stood near it. You've never been inside." He was right, I had not. He pushed the door, and the cold came out to meet us first, the particular cold of a room that is never warmed because no one lives in it, a room kept for something other than the comfort of the living. Then he lit the lamp inside, and I saw the colors. They hung from the high beams on poles of dark wood, 11 of them, the great embroidered standards of the regiment, and they were not the bright, clean banners I had imagined. They were old. Some were so worn that the silk had gone to gauze, the gold thread tarnished to the color of old bone, the edges frayed where centuries of air had eaten at them. One was little more than a rag held together by the names stitched along its border. And along every one of them, worked into the cloth in thread that had once been gold and red and was now the brown of dried earth, were words, places, and under the places names. "Battle honors," Vane said. He set the lamp on the long table in the center of the room and stood looking up at the standards as a man looks at the faces of people he has known. "Every name on that cloth is a place where this regiment stood, and every place is a list of men who did not come home from it. Tomorrow you carry the new color past 200,000 people, and they will cheer, and you will feel like the proudest thing the morning ever made. And you will not know one single thing about what you're carrying." He turned and looked at me, and his eyes in the lamplight were not unkind. They were only very tired and very certain. "I'm not going to let that happen, not on my watch. Sit." I sat. "You think the parade is the marching," he said, as though he had been inside my head the whole way down the corridor. "It isn't. The marching is the easy part. Any fool can learn to march. The parade is the carrying. You carry these." He laid his bare hand flat against the table, fingers spread, the way you would touch something to swear an oath on it. "And you can't carry what you don't know the weight of. So tonight you learn the weight. The names he made me learn, the man who stood me where you're sitting, 40 years ago, I am going to make you learn them. And one night, a long time from now, you'll bring some terrified boy down here and do the same. That is how it does not die. That is the whole of it. Do you understand?" I said I did not, but I knew enough to say so. He pulled a stool to the table and sat across from me, and for a moment he said nothing. The lamp hissed. Somewhere above us the wind worked at the old roof, and one of the standards stirred very slightly, as though it had heard its name about to be spoken. I have thought about that small movement many times since. That night I told myself it was a draft. "We don't start at the beginning," Vane said. "The beginning is too far back. The names there are only names, and you'd lose them by morning. We start with the one that matters most to the men who taught me. We start with the crossing." He lifted his chin toward the oldest standard, the rag held together by its border. "Read me the place." I leaned and squinted, and in the failing thread I made out the word. Aldenmore, I said. The crossing at Aldenmore. The crossing at Aldenmore, he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound less like a place than a person's name. Now the men, read me the first three. I read them. They were only words then, three surnames I had never heard, stitched a finger's width apart, the thread so old it had nearly let them go. I read them flatly, the way you read a list. And Vane held up one hand, not sharply, just a small lift of the palm, and stopped me. No, he said, not like that, not like a roll call. You'll say them like that tomorrow and they'll mean nothing and you'll have wasted my whole night. He leaned forward, and the tiredness went out of his face, and something else came into it, something I can only call hunger, the hunger of a man who has been carrying a thing alone for too long and has finally found somebody to set part of it down with. Each one of these had a face. Each one was 19 like you, scared like you, sure he'd live forever the way you're sure right now. I can't give you their faces. They're gone, and the men who knew their faces are gone, and the men who knew those men are nearly gone too. But I can give you what came down to me. A scrap. One true thing about each, passed mouth to mouth for 100 years and more, the way a coal is carried from one fire to the next so the new fire is the same fire. You learn the scrap, you keep the man. You forget the scrap and he is finally, truly dead, not on the moor but here in the forgetting. That is the only death that's permanent. Do you see now why I don't sleep the night before a parade? I looked at the three names I had just read like a grocery list, and something turned over in my chest, slow and cold, and I felt for the first time the actual weight of the room. The first one, I said quietly, tell me the first one. And Sergeant Holly's Vane, 61 years old, the hardest man I have ever served under, smiled at me for the first time in 4 months. Now you're carrying, he said, now we begin. The first name was Corliss. Vane did not read it off the cloth. He had no need to. He said it the way you say the name of a man you drank with last week. Corliss was the youngest at the crossing, he said. Or so the line came down. A drummer's boy who was not supposed to be in the fight at all, because a drummer is meant to keep to the rear and beat the time and not be in the place where the time runs out. But the river was up that spring, and the only ford was narrow, and a man went down in the middle of it with the color in his hands, the standard you're looking at now, that one, the rag, and it began to fall toward the water. And you have to understand what that meant. The color is not a flag, it is the regiment. If it touches the water, if it's taken, if it goes down in the mud, then the regiment has fallen, and every man fighting around it knows it in his stomach in the same instant, and that is how a line breaks. So when the color started to fall, the whole crossing held its breath. Vane paused, and I realized I was holding mine. And it was the drummer's boy who caught it, Corliss, the one who wasn't supposed to be there. He dropped his drum in the river and he caught the color before it touched, and he held it up over his head where every man could see it, standing in water to his chest, and he did not let it down. Did he live? I asked. I did not mean to ask. The question came out of me before I knew it was forming. No, Vane said, he did not live, but the color did. And because the color stood, the line held, and because the line held, a great many men who would otherwise have drowned or worse went home to their wives. So the question is not did he live. The question I am teaching you to ask is this: what did he die holding up? And the answer is this: the thing you carry tomorrow. The boy in the river is the reason there is a parade at all. He tapped the table once. Say his name. Corliss, I said. Say what he held. He held the color up out of the water. He did not let it down. That is the scrap, Vane said softly. Keep it, he's yours now. I want to tell you what happened in me, because it is the whole reason I am writing this down. Up until that moment, the names on the cloth had been decoration, the kind of thing you nod at and do not see, the way you do not see the buttons on your own coat. But the instant Vane handed me Corliss, the boy in the river became more real to me than half the men I marched beside. I could not have told you his face. I will never know it. But I knew the cold of that water on his chest, and the weight of the color in his arms and the terrible decision he made in the half-second, the standard began to fall, and that knowing was a kind of ownership, and the ownership was a kind of debt. I had carried nothing in my life. I was suddenly carrying a boy who had been dead 200 years. You feel that, Vane said, watching my face. It was not a question. Good, that feeling is the regiment. Not the marching, that. We went on. The second name was Aldous Rain, who at the crossing had been a corporal of the picket, and had seen the ford before anyone, had counted the enemy in the gray before dawn and run 2 miles back through the dark with the count, and had been believed by an officer who had every reason not to believe a man waking him with bad news, and the believing had saved the army the rout, because the regiment was awake and stood to when the blow came instead of dying in their blankets. His scrap is this, Vane said. Rain is the man who told the truth when it was unwelcome and was believed because he had never once lied. You will meet 100 officers in your life. Be the man they believe. That's Rain. Say it. I said it. I said Rain, and I said that he told the unwelcome truth and was believed, and as I said it I understood that I was not learning history. I was being handed away to be a man, wrapped inside the name of one. Each scrap was a lesson sewn into a person, so it would not be forgotten the way bare lessons are forgotten. You do not remember, always tell the unwelcome truth. You remember Rain running 2 miles in the dark, and the officer rising from his cot to believe him. The man is how the lesson survives. The third name was Heatherton, and Heatherton's scrap was a hard one, and Vane gave it to me without softening it. Heatherton ran, he said, at the start. When the first volley came across the ford, Heatherton broke and ran for the trees, and a dozen men saw him do it. I waited for the rest, certain there would be a redemption, a turning back, a glory. There was not. He ran 100 yards, Vane said, and then he stopped. Nobody made him. No officer was watching him by then. He could have kept going and been over the hill and gone. But he stopped, and he stood in the field alone for a moment, and then he turned around and walked back into it. And he died at the color with the others. His name is on the cloth, same as Corliss, same size, same gold. Vane looked at me. Why do you think we kept Heatherton? We could have left the runner off. The men who stitched this had every right to leave him off. I did not know, I said so. Because Heatherton is the truest one of all, Vane said. Corliss never ran, and that's a fine thing, but it's a thing you're born to or you're not. Heatherton ran, and was as frightened as a man can be, and he came back anyway. That is the only courage most of us will ever get the chance at, not the kind that never feels fear, but the kind that feels all of it and turns around. When you are standing on that route tomorrow and your nerve goes, and it will go, for a moment it goes for everyone, you will not think of Corliss. Corliss is too far above you. You will think of Heatherton, who ran 100 yards and came back, and you will turn your own nerve around the same way. That is why we kept the runner. He's the one for ordinary men. He's the one for you. Vane's voice dropped. He was the one for me, the night before my first parade, when my hands shook so hard I dropped my own buckle twice. Say his name. Heatherton, I said, and my voice was not entirely steady, and Vane heard it and did not remark on it, which was its own kindness. He came back, I said. He was afraid and he came back. He's yours, Vane said. Now you have 3. 3 men carried 100 years to you across a table by an old man who got them the same way. Stand up. Walk to the standard. Put your hand near the names, not on them, the cloth won't bear it, and tell me you have them. I stood. My legs were not quite my own. I crossed the cold floor to the rag of a color that the boy Corliss had held up out of the river, and I raised my hand toward the 3 names I now owned, and the lamplight shook on the old gold thread, and somewhere far off above the roof, a bell began to count the hour. I did not look at the cloth. I looked at the dark between the names, where the faces should have been, and I said their names into that dark like a man making a promise to people who could not hear him and might, against all sense, somehow know. And behind me, very quietly, Sergeant Vane said, "Good. Now turn around. We've a long way still to go, and the hardest name isn't on that one." We moved down the line of standards as the night wore on, and Vane gave me the regiment one man at a time. I will not set down every name here, because some of them are not mine to spend lightly, and because a list would do exactly the thing Vane spent the night teaching me not to do, turn living men back into ink. But I will give you a few, so you understand what kind of night it was. There was Quill, who at the Second Standards battle had carried a wounded officer 3 miles on his back and set him down in the surgeon's tent, and then walked back into the line without a word, and whose scrap was this: that you do the hard thing and you do not stay for the thanks. There was old Marrow, no relation to anyone you know, Vane said, though I had not asked, who had been the regiment's worst soldier in barracks, drunk and idle and forever on a charge, and its best in the field, the man you wanted on your flank when it mattered, and whose scrap was a warning and a mercy at once. That you do not know what is in a man until the day comes that asks him, and you are a fool to write any man off before that day. There was a fellow whose surname had worn entirely off the cloth, so that only the faint ghost of the first letter remained, and Vane stopped at him longest of all. We lost his name, Vane said. It went into the thread, and the thread went into the air, and now there is a man on this color who stood and died for the regiment, and we cannot say who he was. That terrifies me more than anything else in this room, not the dying, the forgetting. He did everything Corliss did, and we cannot even say his name over him. He was quiet a moment. So we gave him one. The line that taught me called him the Nameless, and his scrap is the whole reason for tonight. He's the proof of what happens when the carrying stops. One generation forgets to bring the boy down to the guardroom, and a man who gave everything becomes a blank space in a cloth. You are looking at the cost of a single missed night. Don't you ever let it be your night. I told him I would not. I meant it the way you mean a thing at 19, with your whole chest and no idea yet what it will cost you. He looked at me as though he could see the not knowing and let it pass. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning, when I finally asked him the question I had been carrying since the corridor. "Sergeant," I said, "the man who taught you 40 years ago, who was he?" Vane did not answer at once. He sat down on the stool again, slowly, the way a big old man sits when his knees have had enough of a stone floor, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "His name was Garrick Mowbray," he said, "color sergeant. He'd done 30 years when I came in green, and he was the most frightening human being I had ever stood next to, and I would have walked into the sea for him by the end of my first year, and I never told him so because you didn't tell Mowbray things." A short breath that was almost a laugh. "I expect you've heard the same said about me. I expect I learned it off him without meaning to. We pass down more than the names in this place. We pass down the man who taught us, whether we like it or not. I have caught myself standing the way Mowbray stood 100 times. Tomorrow you'll catch yourself standing the way I do. That's not a thing to be proud or ashamed of. It just is. It's how the thing keeps its shape." "What was his scrap?" I asked. "Mowbray's." "If you had to put him on the cloth." The question seemed to take him somewhere. He was quiet for a long moment, and the lamp burned down a little, and one of the standards stirred again in the draft that I no longer entirely believed was a draft. "That's the thing about the cloth," he said at last. "The men on it are easy. They're finished. Their whole life closed into one true thing 100 years ago, and there it stays, fixed, safe, learnable. The living don't fit on the cloth because they're not done. Mowbray's not on any standard. He died in a hospital bed 9 years ago with his boots off, an old man among other old men, and there was no battle in it and no glory, just a long, quiet going out. The world will tell you that's a smaller death than the boy in the river. The world is wrong. I sat with him at the end. He didn't talk about the battles. You know what he talked about?" Vane looked up at me. "He talked about the names, right to the last. He lay there and he said the old names over to himself the way another man might say his prayers, Corliss and Rain and Heatherton and the Nameless and 40 more, getting them in their order, making sure he still had them, frightened he might lose one before he could hand them on. He'd handed them to me 20 years before, but it wasn't enough for him to have handed them once. He had to know they were safe. The last full sentence Garrick Mowbray ever spoke to me, the very last, was a question. He took my wrist, hard, harder than I thought he had left in him, and he said, "Have you given them the runner yet? Have you given the boys Heatherton?" And I said yes. I'd given a dozen recruits Heatherton by then. And he let go of my wrist and he lay back and he said, "Good. Then he's safe." And he meant the runner, dead 200 years more than he meant himself. And those were the last clear words he had. I could not speak. The cold of the room had got into me entirely, and it was not unpleasant. It was the cold of standing very near something true. "So that's Mowbray's scrap if you want it," Vane said, and his voice had gone rough at the edges. He spent his last strength making sure the dead would not be forgotten, and gave no thought at all to whether he himself would be. And here I am, you see, saying his name in this room to a boy who'll outlive me by 50 years. So I suppose I've put him on the cloth after all. He's there now, right between the standards where you can't see him. He cleared his throat hard and stood, and the moment of softness folded itself away. Garrick Mowbray, color sergeant, his scrap is. He carried the name so well that he forgot to be afraid of his own forgetting. Say it back to me. "Garrick Mowbray," I said. "He carried the name so well he forgot to fear being forgotten." "Now he won't be," Vane said. "Not while you're above ground. That's the trade. That's all any of us get, and it's more than the world gives most men. You carry me, I carry Mowbray. Mowbray carried the runner. The runner carries the boy in the river, and the boy in the river is why the gates open in the morning." He turned the lamp up again, and the standards came back out of the shadow. "We're not finished. There's one more I have to give you tonight, and it's the one I've been walking us toward the whole time, and you're not going to want it. Sit back down." I sat. Something in his voice had changed, gone careful, the way a man goes careful around an old wound. "This last one isn't 100 years old," Vane said. "This one I knew. This one I stood beside on the route on a morning much like the one you'll have tomorrow." He did not sit. He stayed standing over me, and the lamplight caught the lines of his face, and for the first time all night the hardest man in the regiment looked to me simply old. And this is the name that's going to make tomorrow mean something, or make it mean nothing. So listen the way you've never listened in your life. He did not point at any standard. There was no standard for this one. He simply said the name into the cold air of the room. "Daniel Ashcombe," he said. "We came in the same week, 41 years ago. He stood the wall beside me for the better part of 19 years. He was a better soldier than I will ever be, and a better man. And he is the one who first told me what this room was for, because Mowbray told him first, and Daniel and I came down here together one night the way you and I have tonight." Vane's jaw worked. "And there is no scrap of Daniel on any cloth, because Daniel did not die at a crossing or hold a color out of a river. Daniel grew old like Mowbray, like I'm doing now. And 9 winters ago he had a bad heart, and it stopped one morning in his own kitchen, and that was the end of him, and a few of us carried him, and that was that. He stopped. But that is not why I'm telling you about Daniel." I waited. "I'm telling you about Daniel," Vane said, "because of what he made me promise, and how I nearly broke it, and what it cost. Sit still. This is the only time I'll say this part." He turned and looked at the row of standards rather than at me, which I have since understood was so that he would not have to watch my face while he said it, or so that I would not have to watch his. "There was a year, about 15 back, when I went sour," Vane said. "I'll not dress it up. I'd buried my wife, and the regiment had passed me over for something I'd wanted, and I'd decided the way a bitter man decides that all of this was foolishness. The marching, the cloth, the names. Dead men. Old rags. I persuaded myself the whole ceremony of it was a thing we did to fool the public and ourselves, and I stopped believing the carrying meant anything at all. And in that year, 2 recruits came up green and ready for their first parade, and it fell to me to bring them down here, and I did not do it. I told myself I'd no time. I told myself they'd learn it on their own, off the cloth, if it mattered to them. I left the door locked. I left those 2 boys to carry the colors past 200,000 people knowing nothing of what they carried. Vane's hands had closed slowly into fists at his sides. And Daniel found out. And Daniel, who never raised his voice to me in 19 years, raised it then. He stood in my quarters and he said, "You don't get to stop. You don't have the right. You didn't make those names and they're not yours to let fall. 100 men kept them alive through worse years than your bad one, and you'll not be the link that breaks because you're sad. You'll take those boys down tomorrow or I'll know you for a smaller man than the runner who came back." Vane was quiet. He compared me to Heatherton, you understand, and found me wanting, and he was right. "Did you take them down?" I asked. "I took them down," Vane said. "The next night. I was ashamed the whole while and I did it badly because shame makes a poor teacher, but I did it and they got the names. And one of those 2 boys is a sergeant himself now in another company and brings his own recruits down to do the same. So the chain held. It held because Daniel stood in my room and refused to let me be the break. He turned back to me at last. And then Daniel died that same winter. And here is the thing I carry, the thing that is heavier than any name on that cloth. I never thanked him. I never told him he'd saved me from a thing I could not have lived with. You didn't tell Daniel things, you see, the same as you didn't tell Mowbray, the same as you don't tell me. And I let that habit cost me the one sentence I most needed to say to the best friend I ever had. And now he is 9 years in the ground, and the sentence is still in my mouth, and there is nowhere left to put it. The room was very still. Even the standards had stopped their stirring. "So I am putting it here," Vane said. "Tonight, I am telling you who will remember it because I cannot tell him. Daniel Ashcombe kept me from breaking the chain in the year I'd have broken it, and I never thanked him, and a man should be thanked while he can hear it. That is his scrap. That is what you carry of Daniel. Not a river, not a color. A man who held another man to his duty when that man had lost the will to hold himself. Say his name." "Daniel Ashcombe," I said. My voice had gone to almost nothing. "Say what he did." "He wouldn't let you be the break," I said. "He held you to the names when you'd let them fall." And the part I should have said to him. I understood then what he was asking me to carry, and why it was the heaviest thing in the room, and why he had walked us toward it all night long. "Thank you," I said, for the dead man into the cold. "Thank you, Daniel. You didn't let him stop." Sergeant Holly's Vane turned his face away from me for a moment, and his shoulders, which I had thought were carved out of the same stone as the building, moved once, just once, and were still again. When he turned back his eyes were dry because he was who he was, but the lamplight had been in them and I had seen. "There," he said very low. "Now it's said, now it's somewhere safe." He pressed the heel of his hand once against the table, steadying himself or the moment, I could not tell which. "You'll think this was a story about old battles. It wasn't. Every name I gave you tonight was teaching you the one thing, that nobody on this earth is finished doing their duty just because the parade is over, or the war is over, or they're old, or they're tired, or they're sad, or they've decided it's foolish. You carry until you hand it on. You hand it on, and then you carry that you handed it on. There is no discharge from this. Daniel knew it. Mowbray knew it. The boy in the river didn't get the chance to know it, but he'd have known it. And now you know it, and I have done my duty, and whatever happens to me now, the names are safe for another 50 years. He took a long breath, and the old certainty came back into him, settling over the grief like a man drawing his greatcoat closed. "Stand up. We're nearly done. There's one thing left, and it's not a name. It's a thing I have to show you before the sun comes, so that tomorrow when you carry the color you'll know exactly what your hands are wrapped around." I stood. The bell above us was counting 4. In a few hours the gates of Marchmont would open, and the band would strike up, and I would walk out into the largest morning of my young life, carrying a regiment I had not known existed when the sun went down. "Show me," I said. He led me to the far end of the hall, where a long oak chest stood beneath the newest of the standards. The color I was to carry in the morning, the only one in the room that was not old, its silk still bright, its gold thread still gold. He unlocked the chest and lifted the lid, and inside, laid out on dark cloth, was a small needle and a spool of gold thread, and a thimble worn shiny with use. "Every color gets retired in its time," Vane said. "When the silk goes to gauze like the runners, we lay it to rest up in the beams and we raise a new one. But before the new one is ever carried, a name goes onto it. The first name. So that no color of this regiment is ever carried empty, so that even the brightest new cloth has a man stitched into it from its very first morning." He took up the needle and the thread, and his big hands, which I would not have trusted with anything so fine, were suddenly precise and sure. "And it falls to the senior man to set the first stitch. Mowbray set the first name on the color before this one. He let me thread the needle. I have wondered ever since whether he knew, even then, that I'd be standing here doing this with my own recruit one day. I think he knew. I think Mowbray knew most things." "Whose name?" I asked. "Whose name goes on the new color?" Vane looked at me, and there was something in his face I had not seen all night, a kind of peace. The peace of a man who has carried a long way and can see, at last, the place to set the load down. "Daniels," he said. "Daniel Ashcombe. I have waited 9 years for a new color to be raised so that I could do this, and it is raised, and you carry it in the morning. The regiment doesn't put the old peacetime men on the standards. As a rule, the cloth is for the ones who fell in the field. But the first stitch on a new color is the senior man's to give, and to give to whom he chooses, and I am the senior man, and I choose Daniel. So that the friend I never thanked will be carried past 200,000 people tomorrow on the brightest cloth this regiment owns, by the boy I taught his name to. And in 50 years, when this color is old and you are old, you will bring some terrified recruit down here, and you will point at the first name on the gauze, and you will say, 'Daniel Ashcombe, who held another man to his duty,' and you will hand him on. And that is how I thank him, not with a sentence he can hear, with 100 years of boys saying his name in the dark." He held out the needle to me. "You said it with me," he said, "your hand under mine, the first stitch of the first name, because you are the one who carries it now, and the carrying should begin in your own hand." I will not pretend my eyes were dry. I was 19, and I had no stone in me yet to keep it back, and I did not try. I put my hand under his, and his hand was steady and mine was not, and together, in the cold hall under the 11 standards of the regiment, with the bell counting toward dawn, we set the first letter of Daniel Ashcombe's name into the bright new color I would carry into the morning. The gold thread caught the lamplight. Vane's voice was barely a whisper. "There he is," he said. "There he is, safe now." We finished the name as the gray came up in the high windows. Neither of us spoke much after that. There was nothing left that needed saying. He had said it all and given it all, and I had taken it, and the room had witnessed it the way that room had witnessed 200 years of the same handing on. The parade, the great thing I had thought was the whole of it, I remember less than that night, and I have marched it 40 times since. But I remember the morning of that first one. I remember the gates of Marchmont opening, and the band, and the roar of the crowd along the route, the exact roar I had dreamed of for 4 months. And I remember that it did not touch me the way I'd expected, because I was not listening to it. I was carrying. I had the new color in my hands, and stitched into its corner, where only I and Vane and God could see it, was the first letter of a good man's name, and behind that name stood Mowbray, and behind Mowbray the runner who came back, and behind the runner the boy who held the standard out of the river 200 years before I was born. I carried all of them down that route. The crowd thought they were cheering a young man and a bright flag. They were cheering a chain of the dead that ran back into the dark before any of them was born, and not one of them knew it, and that was right, because it is not the crowd's to know. It is ours to carry. Sergeant Holly's Vane marched that day too, his last great parade as it turned out, 3 places behind me on the right. I did not look back at him. You did not look at Vane, But I knew he was there, and I knew what he was watching, and I have wondered since whether he wept on the march where no one could see, the way old soldiers do, for the friend going past on the color at last. He died the following spring. Quietly, an old man among other old men, his boots off, the way Mowbray went, the way Daniel went, the way the men who carry the names so often go, not on a moor, not in a river, but in a narrow bed at the long end of a long duty done. I sat with him near the finish, the way he had sat with Mowbray, and I will tell you what he talked about, because by then I understood that it would be the names, and it was. He said them over in their order, frightened of losing one, Corliss and Rain and Heatherton and the Nameless and Quill and Marrow and 40 more, and Daniel. And at the very end, when his voice had nearly gone, he took my wrist the way Mowbray had once taken his, and he asked me the question. "Have you taken a boy down yet?" he said. "Have you given anyone the runner?" And I could tell him yes. I had brought 3 recruits down to the Hall of the Colors by then, and given them Heatherton and Corliss, and the Nameless who warns us what forgetting costs, and Daniel Ashcombe who would not let a man be the break. I told him the chain was holding. I told him his name was safe and would be carried by boys not yet born. He let go of my wrist, he lay back. "Good," he said. "Then we're all of us safe." And he was gone before the morning, and the sentence I had not been able to say to Daniel, I said to Vane while he could still just hear it. I said thank you, plainly, the way he had taught me a man should be thanked while he can hear it, and his face moved once, the way it had moved that night over the table and was still. I am the senior man now. There is a new color being raised this year, and when it is, I will take up the needle and the worn thimble, and I will set the first stitch. And the first name on the brightest cloth this regiment owns will be Holly's Vane, who carried the name so faithfully that he spent his last parade marching a friend past 200,000 people who would never know. And some night soon I will find a frightened boy of 19 on his cot, polishing a buckle already as bright as it will ever be, and I will say, "Bring your gloves and a clear head, not your rifle." And I will take him down the dark corridor to the cold room full of standards, and I will give him the names he must learn. They are the only thing we truly own in the end, not the marching, not the mourning, the names. We carry them out of the dark and into the dark again, hand to hand, mouth to mouth, like a coal kept burning from one fire to the next, so that no man who ever stood for us is left at the last to that one death that is forever the forgetting. That is the duty. There is no discharge from it, and I would not take one if it were offered.